The night everything shifted, I need every senior watching this to pause, just for a moment, and truly listen. What I am about to share isn't a prediction of physical events, nor a message meant to stir panic. It is a spiritual story, a visionary parable, something I believe God placed on my heart with such weight that I wrestled with sleep for nights afterward. It didn't come as thunder or flashing lights. It came as quiet, trembling conviction. I sensed that God had whispered something meant specifically for Americans over 65. It began 3 nights ago, long after filming had ended and the day's noise had faded. I've been portraying Jesus again, another scene about faith, prayer, and perseverance. Normally after filming, I feel peaceful, but that night, something felt different, heavy, electric. It was as if the air itself was trying to tell me a secret. I tossed and turned, thinking about seniors I love, my parents. Both in their 70s, the elders in my church, who hug me every Sunday, the faces from community gatherings. Lined with wisdom and years of prayer, their stories drifted in and out of my mind like old hymns. Something inside me kept saying, pray for them, pray now. At 2:47 a.m., the atmosphere around me shifted. Not physically, nothing supernatural or frightening, but spiritually. The room felt thick with presence, the kind that brings both awe and trembling. It was as though God had leaned in close, and then, in that stillness, an impression settled into my spirit stronger than thought, deeper than emotion. It wasn't a voice you hear with your ears. It was the kind you feel in your bones. Pay attention. My older children carry something this nation still needs. The weight of those words dropped me into silence. I closed my eyes, and what followed unfolded like a vivid dream, not literal, not predictive, but symbolic, like the visions the prophets described in Scripture. A story meant to teach, warn, strengthen, and lift. Suddenly, in this spiritual vision, I was no longer lying in my bed. I was standing above a map of America, not the physical one you'd find in a textbook, but a spiritual one, woven with light and shadow. The entire landscape pulsed with motion, like a living heartbeat. Across the nation, I saw seniors, millions of them, shining with a soft, steady glow. They weren't fragile or forgotten. They looked like seasoned warriors, prayer carriers, guardians of generational faith. Their whispers rose like incense. Their tears watered the soil of the nation. Every one of them radiated a kind of spiritual authority I had never seen portrayed on any stage. But around them, swirling in the distance, were shadows, symbolic fears, doubts, loneliness, regrets, unspoken worries about health and finances and family. These shadows weren't monsters. They were pressures, the kind every senior knows too well. And yet, the shadows crept closer, trying to dim the light the elders carried. Above them hovered figures of radiant light warrior angels, symbolic protectors in this vision, watching with anticipation, waiting for something I didn't yet understand. Then the dream shifted. I saw individuals, a woman in Ohio, kneeling beside her bed every morning for decades, whispering prayers over a nation she had never stopped believing in. A veteran in Texas, worn from age but strong in spirit, lifting leaders in prayer even when he himself felt weak. A grandmother in California, battling illness but refusing to stop praying for her family. These weren't characters in a prophecy. They were symbols of America's praying elders, those who have carried faith long enough to understand that storms come and go. But God's faithfulness does not. Then a gentle, urgent impression wrapped around the dream. The enemy does not fear their age. He fears their prayers. The vision wasn't about doom or a date on a calendar. It was about purpose, about a spiritual awakening among seniors on December 15th, not an attack, but a calling. A day to remember, reflect, pray, and rise. In this symbolic story, December 15th represented a turning point not in world events, but in the hearts of older believers across the nation. A moment where heaven whispers, "You are not done. Your purpose is not past. Your prayers are still shaping the future." The dream ended suddenly, and I woke with tears in my eyes, not out of fear, but from the overwhelming sense of how deeply God values His older children, how much heaven still assigns to them, how fiercely their prayers hold back despair, division, hopelessness. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, hands shaking, thinking about the vision, what it meant, what it didn't mean, and why I felt such urgency to share it. Here's what I knew with absolute clarity. This wasn't a prediction. It wasn't a warning of disaster. It was a message about spiritual influence, identity, and the sacred assignment carried by America's seniors. Something is stirring, not outside us, in fires or storms or politics, but within the hearts of God's people. And December 15th in this symbolic story marks a moment where seniors rise into a renewed sense of calling. And that's where this message truly begins, because what came next in the vision changed everything. The 5 pressures facing America's seniors wake up. That's my first line to you, because if you felt the nudge at 2 a.m., if you've been waking with a heaviness you can't name, you're not alone. In the vision I had, what looked like an enemy attack on a single day was actually 5 different pressures converging on older believers. They weren't explosions or headlines. They were subtle, patient, quiet things that wear you down over time. Think of them as spiritual weather storms of feeling, not always visible, but powerful enough to shape decisions, sap courage, and steal what's meant to be given back to you. Your hope, your voice, your calling. I want to walk through each of these pressures with you, not to frighten, but to equip. In the vision, each pressure came like a wave, and every senior I saw faced at least one. Some faced all 5. Some were strong enough to stand, others, overwhelmed, retreated. The difference wasn't luck. It was preparation, posture, and a readiness to refuse agreement with fear. Pressure 1, isolation. This one arrives quietly. It starts with fewer phone calls, then the absence of visitors, then the slow fading of invitations. In the vision, isolation showed up as a gray fog that seeped into living rooms and sat heavy on kitchen tables. The elders who fought it best were those who had prepared relational anchors, neighbors who checked in, small groups that called at set times, young people who made it a point to visit. Isolation strips away conversation, and when conversation stops, so does influence. The antidote in the vision was simple: create a web of human presence. Not digital friends' real presence, a hand on a shoulder, a routine check-in. The seniors who survived this wave were those who had built relationships like lifelines. Pressure 2, doubt. Doubt came next like a cold wind. It spoke as practical concerns. Is my life still useful? And as spiritual questions. Have my prayers really mattered? In the dream, it took the form of whispering winds that blurred the edges of confidence. I saw prayer journals closed and Bibles put away because the heart believed its work was done. The weapon against doubt was remembrance. Recounting answered prayers, singing old songs, reading letters you'd kept from past seasons. The seniors who kept a ledger of God's faithfulness, small or large, didn't crumble. They remembered that every faithful day had a deposit, and those deposits reached forward when faith felt thin. Pressure 3, sickness of spirit. This isn't always physical illness. In the vision, it looked like a heavy sleep that settled over the soul. Apathy, spiritual tiredness, the small surrender of daily disciplines. You'll recognize it if you've ever found yourself skipping prayer because it felt hard, or choosing television over worship because it's easier. It's a subtle theft. The elders who pushed back were those who kept a war room of the heart, simple rituals that anchored them. A 10-minute morning prayer, a scheduled psalm at lunch, communion at a set hour. The vision stressed ritual, not legalism, but disciplines that become rope ladders back up when the spirit slips. Pressure 4, family friction. This one cuts sharp because it comes from people you love. In that night vision, family division looked like a small, persistent ember that, when fanned by stress or misunderstanding, became a wildfire. Adult children who were suddenly impatient, grandchildren confused by heated conversations, partners who argued about long, ignored hurts. These were the scenes. The enemy didn't need big betrayals to accomplish his goal. He only needed enough friction to drive the elders to isolation, to silence their prayers, to doubt their influence. The remedy shown was radical blessing, not forced forgiveness, but intentional declarations of love. In the dream, seniors who called, who wrote, who blessed even when they were hurt, created a hedge around their homes. Their words became a firewall. Their blessing neutralized the ember before it caught. Pressure 5. Fear about provision. Money, pensions, accounts, these practicalities can become spiritual battlegrounds. In the vision, this pressure looked like a ledger on fire. Numbers that seemed to jump and accounts that looked smaller in the light of worry. Fear about provision is sneaky because it preys on the truth. You did plan, you did save, but then it whispers that those efforts can be lost overnight. I saw seniors collapsing under imagined losses, making desperate decisions, selling peace for the illusion of control. The scene's healing was trust practiced daily, a simple, repeated prayer, not a formula, but a posture, declaring reliance on God's faithfulness. Also, practical safeguards, trusted advisors, written plans, a community that helps manage affairs, acted as ballast in the storm. After each pressure came two kinds of outcomes. In some households, elders folded inward, turning off their radios, avoiding calls, letting the Bible collect dust. In others, a different response unfolded. These seniors did ordinary things with extraordinary faith. They set alarms to pray at strange hours. They called people who had hurt them and said, "I bless you." They wrote down phone numbers on paper in case devices failed. They broke bread quietly in their kitchens and read scripture with trembling hands, not because they were super saints, but because they were determined to refuse agreement with fear. Here's a truth the vision impressed on me: the pressures were not merely individual. Each pressure targeted a different function of a senior's spiritual impact. Isolation aimed to silence testimony. Doubt tried to close the well of intercession. Sickness of spirit stole the mantle of daily consistency. Family friction severed lineages of blessing. Financial fear tried to make seniors trade their faith for frantic decisions that would weaken future generations. The most heartbreaking part of the vision was watching those who had once been mighty in prayer, those who had pleaded for marriages, for cities, for nations hesitate at the first sign of pressure, not because they were weak, but because everything in them had been wounded by slow attrition. It felt like watching seasoned soldiers lowering their banners after one long campaign. But hope pulsed through every scene, stronger than any wave. The seniors who weathered these pressures had something in common. They took tiny, tangible steps. They didn't wait for grand strategies. They wrote names down. They made a small list of people to bless. They prepared a simple communion at home. They agreed on a group check-in at set times. They refused to measure reality by headlines, and instead measured it by the promises they had seen in years past. And then, just when the weight of the 5 pressures felt most suffocating in the vision, there was a hinge moment. A single house, one humble living room, became a lighthouse. The senior in that house, after hours of prayer, and after making the smallest but most intentional gestures, felt a warmth settle like a mantle. Not a flashy miracle, not a public spectacle. It was private and steady, clarity of heart, courage to bless, and a boldness to keep praying. In that moment, I realized what the pressures were actually trying to hide: a transfer. The same pressures that could cripple could also refine. They had the potential to clear away things that were holding back a deeper anointing: old regrets, small comforts that had become idols, patterns that needed to be surrendered. Like a refiner's fire, the pressures could purify what remained and make the soul ready for something larger. The chapter in the vision closes on that lighthouse, on a hand lifting a cup of juice and bread, on a notebook where a list of forgiven names is being ticked off, on a phone left unanswered because the senior chose prayer instead. The light in that room grew. Outside, the gray fog shivered. The whispering wind slowed. The ember that had threatened the family cooled, and then a hush, so deep it felt like the moment before an orchestra begins. In the vision, something was being set into motion. Not a disaster, not a headline, something quieter, more decisive. A readiness. I sat up in my bed when I woke, and my hands were cold from that night's vision. I knew the pressures were real for many of you. They are not allegory but daily life. I also knew the antidotes were real, and simpler than fear wants you to believe. There was one final impression before the dream closed, a question posed not to me, but to every listening heart. Will you choose to prepare even in the smallest ways? The answer, in the vision, separated those who would merely survive from those who would step into what comes next. The noon hour of testing, there's a moment in every story, ancient or modern, when the pressure shifts from the outside to the inside. When the tests stop being about circumstances and start being about the heart. In the vision I saw, this moment came symbolically at midday, not tied to a clock on the wall, but to a deep inner crossing, a place where seniors across the country faced something subtle, personal, and sacred, the test of endurance. In the dream, as the symbolic noon hour approached, I watched thousands of seniors across the nation step into a kind of spiritual fog. Not darkness, just heaviness. It was the weight of long years, long prayers, long battles. The kind of weariness that makes even the faithful whisper, "Lord, I'm tired. I've done my part. Isn't it someone else's turn now?" This hour, the inner noon, was the moment the shadows from earlier began to influence everything. The doubts, the loneliness, the unresolved family wounds, the fear about the future. They gathered like clouds. Noon didn't look like danger. It looked like overwhelm. Some seniors sat at kitchen tables sorting bills, feeling defeated by numbers they didn't fully understand anymore. Others lay on recliners, staring at ceilings, hearing echoes of old mistakes. Some watched the news and felt swallowed by world events they could no longer control. Others simply stared at their hands, remembering days when they had more strength, more clarity, more certainty. That was the nature of the noon hour. It made people look inward, and sometimes inward is the hardest place to face. But in the vision, something else was happening at the same time. Something sacred that wasn't immediately visible. There were seniors who rose slowly, almost reluctantly, from their chairs. They weren't stronger. They weren't holier. They were simply willing to keep going. They walked to shelves and reached for worn Bibles. They opened journals. They touched photos of family members with trembling hands. They whispered prayers, soft, broken ones, but prayers nonetheless. And heaven responded. In their homes, a quiet glow began to build, not a light seen with eyes, but a warmth felt in the spirit. It was the glow of endurance, the glow of faith that refuses to die, the glow of a heart that says, "Lord, I'm still here." Then the scene shifted. In the symbolic vision, I saw a massive, gathering millions of seniors seated at tables across the nation. A hush fell across all of them. Before each one was a simple plate and a simple cup, not fancy, not ceremonial, just ordinary elements. It reminded me instantly of communion, but it wasn't a ritual led by a pastor. It was personal, deeply personal. This moment represented something essential, remembering. When the older generation remembers God's faithfulness, something happens in the spiritual atmosphere. Memories become weapons. Old testimonies become fresh strength. Tears become prayers, and prayers become openings for heaven's power. In the dream, seniors lifted those simple elements, bread in one hand, a cup in the other, and whispered, "Lord, I remember. I remember when you healed me. I remember when you carried me. I remember when you saved my child. I remember when you stretched what I had. I remember when you met me in the quiet places. I remember when you forgave me. I remember when I nearly lost hope, and you pulled me back." And as they remembered, something profound happened. The symbolic heaviness pressing on their hearts began to crack apart like ice under sunlight. The fog thinned, the weight lifted. Their eyes brightened, not with youth restored, but with purpose revealed. In that moment, I understood something startling. The noon hour of testing wasn't designed to break them. It was designed to reveal them. Reveal what? Their mantle, their calling, their endurance, their authority. Because in the vision, as that symbolic communion spread across the nation, the seniors who participated, who remembered, who blessed, who forgave, who reconnected, received something unseen but incredibly real, clarity, a spiritual clarity that could slice through confusion like a blade. Their shoulders straightened, their voices steadied, their prayers took on weight. One scene stood out: a single grandmother in the Midwest. Earlier, she'd been overwhelmed by a sudden flood of worry about her health. She felt tightness in her chest and a spinning of her thoughts. But after taking communion in the vision, she touched her chest, breathed deeply, and whispered, "This is not who I am. This is not from God," and peace washed over her. Another senior, a retired pastor in Florida, had been battling confusion, fearing he was losing his memory. After communion, he opened his Bible, and the verses leapt off the page with clarity he thought was gone forever. A widower in New York, paralyzed by loneliness, suddenly felt a warmth beside him, as though the presence of God had sat down in the empty chair opposite him. These weren't miracles of the body, they were miracles of the heart. No prophecy of doom, no prediction of disaster. Just spiritual healing, spiritual reawakening, spiritual resilience. I felt something in the vision shift again. A sound, soft at first, then louder. A chorus rising from different homes, different states, different generations. "Lord, I'm not finished yet." It was as though heaven responded to that one sentence. The symbolic angels I'd seen earlier, the protectors, leaned forward. The shadows, already weakened, began drifting away, and the map of America warmed with a slow spreading glow. Then came the part that startled me the most. The seniors began speaking, not shouting, not preaching, but declaring. Over their families, over their homes, over their cities, words of blessing, not fear, words of promise, not worry, words of hope, not despair. A grandmother walked her hand across a family photo and prayed over every face. A veteran touched a folded flag and prayed for every leader in his nation. A mother who had lost a child prayed for broken families everywhere. A father estranged from his son whispered forgiveness into the air, trusting God to carry it. It was as if noon, the hour that brings the harshest light, was now illuminating hidden strength. At the very end of this symbolic scene, I saw one more image, an hourglass turning over, not counting down to danger, counting up to destiny. The message was unmistakable. The noon hour is not where the story ends. It's where the story turns. As the vision faded, a single question pressed into my spirit, gentle, honest, and full of hope. When the noon hour comes to you, will you remember who you are? The hour of the heart, families, forgiveness, and the quiet battle. Every vision has a moment that hurts to watch, one scene that cuts deeper than the rest. For me, it wasn't the fog of doubt, or the gray heaviness, or even the noon-hour struggle from the chapter before. It was what came next, symbolized in the dream as the afternoon hour, a time when shadows grew longer and hearts became tender, almost vulnerable. This part of the vision centered around families, the very people seniors pray for, cry for, worry about, and love with a fierceness only years can produce. What I saw wasn't an attack from outside. It was something far gentler and far more familiar, old wounds resurfacing. It started with small things, a grown daughter remembering a harsh sentence spoken 30 years ago, a son recalling a decision he didn't agree with, a grandchild struggling to understand why the world feels so divided, a spouse revisiting a disagreement that neither could even trace the origin of an amour. Individually, these memories were minor, but in the symbolic dream they gathered like sparks blown together by wind, and suddenly those small sparks seemed ready to ignite into something larger. This wasn't a prophecy of strife, it wasn't a sign of doom. What the vision revealed was much simpler and far more human. Every family, no matter how loving, carries quiet cracks, and moments of inner testing tend to expose them. As those sparks glowed brighter, seniors across the symbolic landscape began to feel misunderstood, unseen, or unappreciated. Not loudly, not dramatically, just in the quiet places, the heart, the memories, the questions. Why doesn't my son call more? Why does my daughter seem frustrated with me? Did I fail my family somewhere along the way? Why does it feel like the world is pulling us apart? These thoughts curled into the atmosphere like smoke. They weren't attacks, they were invitations to discouragement. But then something surprising happened. The same seniors who felt the sting of these questions began doing something unexpected, something gentle and holy. They walked to their war rooms, their prayer chairs, their quiet corners. They picked up pens. They lifted their hands. They inhaled deeply as tears shimmered in their eyes, and they chose blessing. In the vision, blessing looked like light, thin at first, then thicker, stronger, brighter. It flowed from the mouths of seniors like warm breath in winter. It drifted across rooms and down hallways. It moved through phone lines and across miles. It slipped under the doors of adult children and settled softly on their shoulders. Blessing didn't deny the wounds. It didn't erase the memories. It didn't pretend nothing had happened. Blessing simply decided, I will not let past hurt dictate the love I give today. I saw one grandmother writing a letter not lengthy, not eloquent, just 6 simple words, I love you, I'm proud of you. She folded it carefully, hands trembling. I saw a father calling a grown son, saying nothing more than, I miss hearing your voice. I saw a widow blessing her children by name, whispering prayers for their protection and peace. I saw a grandfather sending a text message that read, no matter what we've walked through, you are still my heart. Each blessing, each gesture, each intentional choice caused the symbolic sparks of division to dim, flicker, and eventually fade out. Then something even more powerful appeared. In the vision, every family that received even silently some measure of blessing from their elder began to glow with a faint golden tint. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't supernatural in the cinematic sense, but it was clear that love, freely given, had created a shield. And yet, because visions are honest, not sentimental, there were also seniors who struggled. Some couldn't bring themselves to bless. Their pain was too deep, their exhaustion too heavy, their memories too raw. They sat quietly, tears welling, whispering, Lord, I don't know how to fix this. And heaven, in the dream, answered not with correction, but with compassion. A warm light wrapped around them, the same way a parent wraps a child in a blanket. A gentle voice, more felt than heard, breathed a truth into their weary spirits. You are not responsible for the outcome. You are responsible for the offering. Tears ran freely, then real tears, even on my face as I slept. The vision shifted to a symbolic map once more. Lines representing family ties, thick, thin, broken, repaired, began to shimmer. Some lines brightened. Some slowly mended. Some remained fragile but hopeful. The message was unmistakable. Families are not perfect. They are battlegrounds of love and healing, and seniors hold a unique authority to start the healing. Then came the moment that pierced me most. The dream showed a senior sitting alone, holding an old photograph. Her family had drifted far emotionally, physically, spiritually. She looked so small in that living room. So tired, so unsure if blessing them would matter, but she whispered their names, just their names. Nothing more. And the moment those names left her lips, a beam of golden light, thin as a thread at first, shot across the map and touched each person in the photo. No matter where they lived, no matter how far they'd gone, no matter how cold their hearts seemed. It was then that I finally understood. Blessing isn't about changing others. It's about opening a door God can walk through. Near the end of this chapter of the vision, a symbolic clock appeared again. Its hands ticked toward what looked like late afternoon. The hour wasn't ominous, just significant. A time of reflection. A time to choose love. A time to repair what's been frayed. And before the scene faded, a final question rose, one meant not to pressure, but to invite. Is there someone you need to bless before the next chapter of your calling unfolds? The question didn't demand an answer. It simply lingered soft, patient, hopeful, because in this vision, the way forward for America's seniors always began the same way, with forgiveness, with blessing, with love that refuses to quit, even when hearts feel tired. The evening mantle, a calling passed to the faithful by the time the final part of the vision came. The symbolic sun had begun to set. It wasn't threatening or dramatic, just warm, amber light stretching long across the landscape of the dream. Evening in this vision didn't represent the end of life or loss or closing chapters. It felt more like inheritance, like that sacred hour when a parent sits with a child and says, "There's something I need to give you before I go." This was the chapter that changed me the most. As the symbolic daylight faded, seniors across the nation began to appear again, not weary, not burdened, but steady, weathered like old oak trees, stronger than they realized. Carriers of stories and scars and wisdom and battles survived. Their faces reflected not fear, but readiness. Then in the dream a sound rose in the distance, a soft stirring like wind moving through tall grass. It wasn't loud, it wasn't commanding, it simply carried a sense of expectancy, as if heaven itself were leaning forward. A phrase formed, not heard with ears, but understood in the spirit. Now comes the mantle. The moment those words settled, something extraordinary unfolded. Across the symbolic map of America, pillars of light descended slowly, gently, almost reverently. They did not fall on everyone. They rested on the seniors who had endured the earlier pressures, those who chose blessing over bitterness, remembrance over forgetfulness, endurance over resignation, prayer over despair, and love over fear. The mantle that settled wasn't a physical garment. It was an awakening, a strengthening from within. It felt like a release of dormant purpose, long buried beneath years of caregiving, career, routines, grief, and quiet faithfulness. In the dream, the mantle manifested in different ways for different people. For some, it came as renewed clarity, a sudden understanding of their spiritual authority in prayer. For others, it came as unexpected boldness, the courage to speak life into places they once stayed silent. For others still, it came as a fresh compassion, a love so deep and patient it could heal long, unspoken wounds. 178-year old man in the vision, someone who had nearly given up praying, suddenly felt a warmth fill his hands. When he prayed for his neighbors, it was as if peace walked right through the walls of their homes. A grandmother in Michigan, who had felt invisible for years, suddenly sensed God whisper, "Your words carry more weight than you know." And when she blessed her family that evening, her blessing moved like ripples across a lake. A veteran in Georgia stood at the edge of his porch, tears streaming down his face, because for the first time in a long time he felt useful. Not because he still had strength in his body, but because he had strength in his spirit. The mantle didn't erase age, it honored it. In the vision, I saw seniors whose bodies were tired, but whose spirits stood taller than they ever had in their youth. Their prayers didn't float upward timidly, they thundered upward like declarations carved in stone. The symbolic enemies, the shadows of fear, doubt, loneliness, division, had no strength against them now. They retreated rapidly, the way darkness flees when someone pulls open a curtain. Then the vision shifted again, zooming out to show whole regions glowing brighter where seniors had embraced their mantle places saturated not with noise, but with peace, intercession, and quiet. Unshakable faith. Some states sparkled with this light: Tennessee, Alabama, Oklahoma. Places where pockets of older believers were actively praying, blessing, and supporting one another. Other states glowed faintly at first, but then brightened as seniors chose forgiveness, community, and courage. The dream made something unmistakably clear. This mantle wasn't a reward, it was a responsibility, and it belonged uniquely to America's older generation. Why? Because they had lived long enough to understand cycles. They had endured enough to recognize what truly matters. They had prayed enough to know that God listens. They had suffered enough to know compassion. They had stood long enough to know perseverance. The younger generations needed their stabilizing presence. Their families needed their blessing. Their communities needed their wisdom. Their churches needed their faith, and their nation needed their prayers. At this point in the vision, the light dimmed into deep gold, and one last symbol appeared, an old wooden staff, like the kind passed from mentor to student in ancient times. The staff hovered above the map, glowing softly, and then split into millions of smaller staffs, one for every senior watching, listening, enduring. Each staff floated gently into the hands of an elder who had stood strong through the noon hour and afternoon testing, and the moment they touched it, the mantle settled completely. I heard a whisper then, clear, resonant, unmistakably filled with love. You are not retiring from your purpose. You are entering your influence. Influence not measured in crowds, but in prayers. Not measured in popularity, but in legacy. Not measured in physical strength, but in spiritual steadiness. The vision then showed scenes of what this influence looked like. A grandmother praying for a prodigal child, and that child feeling a sudden, unexplained pull toward reconciliation. A widower praying for his pastor, and that pastor receiving unexpected encouragement at the exact moment he wanted to quit. A couple married 50, 5 years praying for their neighborhood, and the neighborhood experiencing a renewed sense of safety and unity. A senior center where elders gathered once a week to pray, and young families saying they felt hope returning to their community. By the final moments of the dream, the entire symbolic map of America pulsed not with fear or division, but with thousands of points of golden light, each one resting on the shoulders of a senior who had chosen to stand, forgive, bless, remember, and believe. The last thing I saw was the staff glowing in their hands, followed by a sentence that echoed through the dream with quiet strength. Age does not disqualify. Weariness does not diminish. Faithfulness is the crown of the elder. And just as the symbolic sun slipped below the horizon, a final question hung in the air, gentle yet deeply stirring. Will you carry your mantle into the evening of your life? Because if you do, the vision promised something beautiful. What begins in your prayers will continue in your children, your grandchildren, your church, your community, and your nation. The mantle is not a moment. It is a mission, and it rests now with you.